Hey students, welcome to week two. Good job for managing week one. I know it seemed a little crazy at times. There's a lot of work to do. You had to get the books, you had to watch videos, you had to read, right? So kiss your brain, you did it, you made it through week one, which in some ways I think is the hardest to navigate sometimes because you're just trying to figure out how the course works. That said, this week should feel hopefully like we're settling in a little bit more. The deadlines coming up are going to be fairly the regular deadlines, which means your quiz will be due by Wednesday, your discussion board posts are due by Thursday, and then your discussion board responses are due by Saturday. So, and that'll be consistent just about the rest of the term of the course until about week 17 when we start shifting a little bit out of that regularity just to finish up with the rest of the classwork. That said, I want to remind you, if you haven't already, to register on turnitin.com. I am putting grades up there. Those of you who've already done it, thank you so much. You've probably already seen I've graded the introductions, still working through the discussion boards and your quizzes. I do want to warn you too about plagiarism, just to take a moment just to remind you. Just about all of these short stories and poems and plays and novels have been written about extensively, and it's really easy to find somebody else's work online. You can go right to sparknotes.com and it'll tell you all about A&P. And in some cases, students have already been posting discussion board responses that have come off of that. And so I just want to warn everybody out there, the point of taking a literature course is to learn how to read and interpret literature. And if you are really desperate, you don't understand something, something's not quite clicking with you, make sure you send me an email. I'd rather you invest time and energy into figuring out how I can help you learn to read literature versus just reading somebody else's interpretation of it and posting that up on the discussion board. It's very obvious to me who does the reading and who does not. So that said, I just wanted to sort of throw that out there as a quick reminder. So this lecture, I'm going to be talking about just some brief reading strategies, especially as it comes to the things they carried. And then I'm going to talk about structure and symbols, which is the big thing we're going to concentrate on while we're reading stories this week. So, all right, reading strategies. So with regard to the things they carried, and some other stories that we'll be reading, the lottery included, there tends to be a lot of characters in a small space, and it can be difficult sometimes to distinguish between characters. So one strategy that I like to use is just making up a character list as I go through the reading. So if you actually have your book out in front of you, the things they carried starts on page 108. And you'll notice here, right, all I did was just make myself a little table. And I've read this story before, right? But you don't have to know who the characters are before you start, right? You can just make a table kind of as you go along. And if I were just to start reading the first paragraph here, the first sentence says, First Lieutenant Jimmy Cross carried letters from a girl named Martha, a junior at Mount Sebastian College in New Jersey. So I could just, again, make a little list under Jimmy Cross's name. I could just write down that he carries Martha's letters. I can make another character box for Martha and write down that she's a junior at Mount Sebastian College in New Jersey. The second sentence of the story says, They were not love letters, but Lieutenant Cross was hoping. So he kept them folded in plastic at the bottom of his rucksack. In the late afternoon, after a day's march, he would dig his foxhole, wash his hands under a canteen, unwrap the letters, hold them with the tips of his fingers, and spend the last hour pretending. He would imagine romantic camping trips into the White Mountains in New Hampshire. So in that, there's a lot of information there, and depending on how detailed you want to get, you can certainly make as many bullet points as you want. But I just listed reads them daily and daydreams about love, right? Because we're certainly given the hint, or we're actually told explicitly in the second sentence that they are not love letters. Let's see. I'm going to jump down to the second paragraph here. because here's where we get a bigger list of characters happening, and we also get a lot of stuff happening. So the first sentence of the second paragraph says, the things they carried were largely determined by necessity. Among the necessities or near necessities were P38 can openers, pocket knives, heat tabs, wristwatches, dog tags, mosquito repellent, chewing gum, candy, cigarettes, salt tablets, packets of Kool-Aid, lighters, matches, sewing kits, military pavement certificates, sea rations, and 2 or 3 canteens of water. Together, these items weighed between 15 and 20 pounds, depending on a man's habit or rate of metabolism. I'm going to stop the story right there. I could list down everything that they do actually carry, but I think one thing to note here is that there's going to be a ton of gear that these soldiers are having to carry, and it's not necessarily what they carry as a whole or in common. It's actually more important to sort of note the things they carry that differentiate them. So that's actually what I'm going to put on my list. The next sentence starts, Henry Dobbins, who was a big man, carried extra rations. He was especially fond of canned peaches and heavy syrup over pound cake. So right here, I'm going to make a little tab for Henry Dobbins, and remember that he's a big man who carried extra rations, fond of canned peaches. Dave Jensen, who practiced field hygiene, carried a toothbrush, dental floss, and several hotel bars of soap he'd stolen on R&R in Sydney, Australia. Right? Again, I could list all that stuff, but the next sentence says, Ted Lavender, who was scared, carried tranquilizers until he was shot in the head outside of the village of Tai Kay in mid-April. I'm going to stop right there. We know that's really important. So those 3 things in conjunction with each other. We know our narrator is telling us that Ted Lavender is scared. We're told he carries tranquilizers, probably to sort of mitigate that fear, and that he was shot in the head, which becomes really, really important to the story. So as you can see here, this is just a brief reading strategy. That's exactly what I'm doing. It's just every time I come across a character or a new character's name like Mitchell Sanders or Kiowa or Rat Kiley, I'm just going to list things about them that I learn. For instance, if I could point out here, Mitchell Sanders carrying condoms. They're in the middle of war. They're in the Vietnam War. What does it say about a person who's carrying condoms while he's out in the middle of a jungle, right? That tells us what kind of a person he is. So just having this in front of me later when I maybe go to think about structure or think about plot or symbol or anything like that is going to help me keep characters kind of straight. Again, I would recommend maybe doing the same thing for the lottery this week. You're going to have a lot of characters here, and just sort of making up notes as you go is a really helpful way to tackle the stories. So one big component of understanding story is really how to understand the different pieces of a story and how they all come together to make story. And so your book calls this plot. As a writer, I call this the dramatic arc, and so you can refer to it as either or. I often call it the dramatic arc. And so we have 5 different points that we'll want to note. First is the inciting incident. Second is the rising action. Third is the climax, and then we have the falling action, and then the denouement. And all 5 of those parts work together, and you're going to find those parts more or less in just about every story. Notice too, there is kind of an arc to it. So if I was drawing this on the board, right, it would kind of look like this kind of a pattern here, this arc, if you will. All right, so inciting incident. All that means is that this is the moment, usually at the beginning of a story, that changes everything. Sometimes it happens in the first line of a story, and sometimes it happens towards the beginning. But essentially, it takes a normal day that isn't really story worthy, just regular sort of going about the day, and it changes that normal day into now a problem, or there's some kind of conflict that has to be solved. And so it changes everything for a character that day. This is, for A&P, the moment that the girls walk in nothing but bathing suits, right? In fact, that's the first line of the story. We don't even get what normal day at A&P looks like, because fairly quickly in the story, we can tell what a normal day would look like. Sammy clocks in, he checks people in and out, right? Probably straightens stuff up, mops stuff around, right? Goes home. Today is a day unlike no other. because those girls walk in nothing but bathing suits, and it results in Sammy leaving that position. Okay, so that's what's the inciting incident here. When it comes to the things they carried, right, it happens in the second paragraph. The beginning is really going to establish, right, where we are, which is in the jungle of Vietnam, when this is during the Vietnam War, who Lieutenant Jimmy Cross, his platoon, and Martha, who's a junior over at Mount Sebastian College, right, and the men are moving through the jungle at war. And that's what that sort of beginning part does for us. However, in the second paragraph of the things they carried, right on page 108, we are told that Ted Lavender, who was scared, carried tranquilizers until he was shot in the head outside the village of Tai Kay in mid-April. Which, if you aren't looking for that, right, maybe this is the first time you're reading the story, you might overlook this. It just feels like a detail that you're kind of given, and the story continues on with lists of things that they actually carry. But this is a really big moment in the story because this is central to the other things that are going to happen. Okay, so let's look now at rising action. So all that rising action means is that we have the central and the sub-conflicts. They are starting to unfold as we're moving through the story. So the sub-conflicts can be minor obstacles for characters. These can be things that characters can get over pretty easily or solve throughout the course of the story. The central conflict, which is the one that the story is sort of centering on, or it's the biggest problem or conflict, right? That's what's going to be resolved in the climactic moment. For AMP particularly, right, the central conflict is that the girls are in the store. L'Engle warns the girls, right, and Sammy quits as a result. So, well, that's more of the climax itself. But L'Engle, the girls being in the store is a problem, and L'Engle being there is a problem, right? That's part of that central conflict. The other sub-conflict, and you can maybe make an argument that these are also central as well, especially the socioeconomic conflict that Sammy has, right? Not just with the girls, but being sort of dissatisfied with where he is, thinking he can move social class, right, or at least be sort of recognized as one of them, is probably central to the story itself. The other customers present problems only in logistical sensibility, in that Sammy is having to deal with them, Stokesy's having to deal with them, L'Engle as well, right? And so it helps to create tension, especially as the girls move into Sammy's checkout line. The sexual attraction that Sammy has for the girls also creates some tension and some problems, right? Because it's very obvious to see Sammy as a young 19-year-old boy who's attracted to these girls, and that complicates how he's feeling about them sort of being upper middle class or upper class girls. When it comes to the things they carried, the rising action that's starting to unfold, the central conflict, right, is Ted Lavender being dead. We also have Jimmy Cross being distracted by Martha's quote-unquote love, right? The men are also in the middle of a war, so just staying alive and avoiding, mines and death and all of that kind of stuff is really central to the story. So this is already a story that's under a lot of pressure and a lot of tension. So sub-conflicts, just the emotional and the physical weight that the men are carrying in their gear. Again, you could sort of say war, just staying alive, death, enemies. That kind of almost becomes a sub-conflict in that for a moment sometimes when we're reading about Jimmy Cross and Martha, you almost forget that they're kind of in the middle of war. Certainly when Lee Strunk crawls into a tunnel, there's a lot of tension around that moment. The men are essentially all holding their breath, thinking that something's going to happen to him. And then we have some sort of back and forth between the other characters just after the passing of Ted Lavender. And certainly their grief is a big part of a conflict because that's part of what the emotional weight of the gear that the men are carrying. So climax. All that the climax means is that this is the point of no return in a story. So this is where a character has to make a choice. And sometimes characters don't actually make choices, but that's also in itself a choice, right? About the central conflict. So this is the moment where they have to either do something or not do something. They have to take an action or an inaction, right? But it results in solving or resolving that sort of central conflict in whatever way. I often call this the point of sort of highest emotions, just sometimes for the reader, but also the character as well, right? This is the moment of like, oh crap, right? In A&P, this is the moment when Sammy quits. So the central conflict in the story, right, is the girls being in the store, right? Sammy would sure like to go off with these girls or have them recognize him as a hero. That moment when Lingle approaches them, Sammy quits. That is the point of highest emotion, highest investment for the reader. We want to know what just happened, right? For the things they carried, this is the moment when Lieutenant Jimmy Cross burns the letters. So he's trying to deal with his guilt around Ted Lavender. He actually recognizes that it's only a sentimental gesture, but the actual physical burning is a sort of promise. It's a renewal. It's a symbolic gesture of letting Martha go and vowing to sort of take care of the rest of his men. And again, that's the sort of highest point of emotional investment for a reader. Right. So the falling action then, and sometimes what happens immediately after the climax. In the case of A&P, this is just when Sammy has that moment where Lingle says, what did you say? And Sammy said, I quit. And Lingle says, I thought you said that. And Sammy follows the girls, or he thinks he's following the girls, out into the parking lot. That's the falling action, right? Here we have this moment that Sammy thinks he's going to maybe be redeemed, or the girls will sort of wait for him, or they'll know what he did and the gesture will be rewarded. And ultimately we know that it won't be, right? Sometimes this is also when loose ends are actually tied up. So again, it just depends on the story. Every story is a little bit different. Some stories don't actually have too much falling action. In the case of the things they carried, it's a little bit different in that the burning of the letters happens towards the very end of the story itself. And then I'm trying to remember what the things were that happened after that. He sort of Lieutenant Cross promises himself, right, that he's going to take care of his men. He pulls out his maps. He sort of imposes, right, some discipline on the men. And he continues to sort of say that, you know, he's going to take care of them. He would police their acts, right? They would get their shit together. They would keep it together, right? And as a promise, obviously, to the death of Ted Lavender, Jimmy Cross just wants to make sure that the men are going to survive. The last part here is often called the resolution, the conclusion, or the fancy word, if you want to, denouement. And all that really means is that it's an ending or a resolution in a story. Now, resolution does not always mean that all of the problems are solved. In fact, in contemporary short fiction, that often means that its problems are not solved, right? Sometimes it's just the way the central conflict itself comes to an end or is resolved. What a resolution in a short story really does is establish a new normal for the central characters. And again, what I mean by that is the new normal is a moment in which the characters have been changed by that experience and now have to move through life in a different way, perhaps. So for Sammy, he's lost his job, and we know that life from here on out will be very hard for him. And we don't know what that necessarily means, but the new normal means his life is going to be hard. In the things they carried, the ending or the resolution is the promises that Lieutenant Jimmy Cross makes to himself. And his letting go of the idea that his obligation is not to be loved. So he sort of lets go of that love he's yearning for at the beginning of the story, and he lets it go in order to lead his men. And that's the resolution in the story, even though it doesn't bring Ted Lavender back, right? It doesn't necessarily solve anything. It's just a way that he's going to move from here on out. So that's dramatic arc in a story. Your book puts the things they carried in the structure chapter because the things they carried really does the dramatic arc well. but it's a very circular kind of a plot. And what I mean is, and you'll notice this while you're reading it, Ted Lavender, the moment of Ted Lavender getting shot, I think reoccurs in the story somewhere like 6 times, 7 times, something like that. And so we get this notion of kind of going back to that one moment. And one question I'd like to throw out to you is, why in the world would Tim O'Brien, our writer, structure a story in which he sort of circles back to that inciting incident again and again? What would be the purpose, or what would be the point? And why, as a reader, does that not necessarily, it does feel repetitive, but it also feels necessary, and it still feels like we're moving forward in a story. I think in a lot of ways O'Brien breaks the traditional structure rules and really gives us a powerful story about love and loss and war. So moving on to symbols in literature, your book gives us a few archetypal or universal symbols to pay attention for. I'm certainly going to give you a lot more today in that. These are things you want to be paying attention for, not just in story, but in poetry, in plays, in film as well. These are things that are specific to Western literature and culture. Certainly, there are lots of times when a color is just a color, for example, and it doesn't necessarily mean anything. However, I want to caution you, right? Symbols, or let me restate that. Nothing in literature happens on accident. Let me say it again. Nothing in literature happens on accident. These are works of art. So for instance, as a story writer, not only am I going to put down a plot with a well-developed character and something happens to that character and hopefully the writing is good, but I'm also going to be, especially in my editing phases, looking at symbol and how those things can work in relationship to the themes, right? The character, the feelings, right? All of that good stuff. So nothing is on accident for the most part. So you, as a student of literature, should be looking at these things and asking yourself, okay, well, why would the writer choose that at this moment? What's the point? Does that speak to something else or something larger that's happening here? So please evaluate context when you're looking at these symbols too. You want to be able to support those symbols with the scene or the setting or the mood around it, right? It's not anything that's sort of not tethered to other things. Let me see here. Let's actually move into some of these symbols. So day and night. Day could be the rising of the sun. Sometimes that represents new day or new life or new light or understanding. Especially sometimes in the morning, right? When characters sort of wake up in the morning, right? It's a new day and sort of new things will happen. So it can be a beginning, it can mean opportunities, it can be hope. Night, oftentimes, can mean death, it can mean darkness, it can be an ending, it can be an unknown. This is why scary movies sometimes happen in the night, right? Because characters don't know what's going to happen to them. Again, it's not on accident. Light and dark, same kind of a thing here. Light oftentimes means truth, enlightenment, illumination. It could be some kind of godly or religious symbolism. I put quote unquote good because sometimes we're not really sure what good means, if that's, in the moral sense, or a character who maybe thinks that they're good and they're not. Dark, certainly the opposite of that, right? Shadows, think of obscurity, unknown, death, or the angel of death, or dying, right? Dark can also hide objects and characters and information. So when a scene takes place in the dark or characters don't have, lights on, it's probably because they're often in quest for some more information. Again, similarly related here, sun and moon. The sun oftentimes represents masculine energy. It's the known, it's the illumination, it's good or goodness, it's life, it's God, it's hope. Sometimes it can also mean glory, fame, fire, right? Anything like that. The moon is often represented as female energy. It can mean mystery or unknown. The moon can hold secrets. There's also this attitude of maybe clairvoyance or intuition around the moon as well. It can be emotion or emotionally charged, right? Think of the tides sort of moving in and out. Depth, darkness, death, rebirth, serenity. Certainly all of those things work. Earth signs. Water can mean religious, a baptism, a birth, a purification. It can also mean death or drowning or the emotional state of drowning. It can mean fertility or life force as well, right? Water, think of lakes and the ocean, give us life. And for people who live on water, right, that certainly means a life force itself. Air oftentimes refers to some kind of angelic reference, right, or purity. Clouds can represent heaven. Or something sort of otherworldly. Fire, anger, passion, fury, it can be pain, it can be death, it can also be a rebirth. So again, if you're noticing a pattern here of, well, a lot of these symbols overlap, how will I know if one sort of represents, rebirth or one represents death? Again, you have to take that into account of how you're trying to apply that symbol. If your story is already dealing with some death and then there's some fire happening in it, right, then it's probably death related. If you think about the things they carry, right, when Lieutenant Cross goes to burn those letters from Martha, right, and promises to himself that he is going to take better care of his men, right, that's a rebirth. He's trying to cleanse and purify. He's trying to forgive himself essentially by lighting those letters on fire, getting rid of Martha, right, purifying himself and promising that he's going to take better care of his men. Earth, again, masculine energy. This could be, actual earth or dirt or soil, rock, nature, plants, right? Oftentimes has a solid quality to it, meaning that it's immovable or it's something reliable, something that a character can maybe count on. Colors, there's lots of colors and they often play roles in stories. They can represent emotions too, like anger, love, jealousy, or sadness. Certainly there's lots of colors that mean other things too. Sometimes blue can mean peace or tranquility. We've all heard of singing the blues. That can mean sadness or loss or depression. Purple can mean royalty or privilege. Yellow, a new beginning, right? Sunlight or light. So think about any of those meanings that we talked about earlier when it comes to light and the sun. Red can mean love, anger, passion, fury, fire even. Green, nature, life, peace. It can also mean, if you've ever heard being green with envy, right? Or jealousy. Brown can be nature, natural. It can also be decay, right? Black, death, dying, maybe the unknown, and white, innocence or purity. So again, as a author, nothing is on accident. If a character is wearing a blue shirt, I promise you that that author probably thought about what blue meant in context to what's happening in the story. So again, as a student of literature, when you're really breaking down these stories, you need to actually sort of look at all of the details and see what they add up to. The phallic and the yonic symbols. Phallic just means the potency of a male, right? Often, sometimes can be things like guns, sticks, swords, pillars, obelisks, right? So think of like a big monument, right? Something that seems very sort of penis related, but it oftentimes means strength of a male. It can also mean patriarchal society in terms of rule and power. Yonic symbols, so anything that's sort of female related, female sexuality, fertility, certainly caves, pots, rooms, full-blown roses oftentimes is a yonic symbol. So again, those are things we're going to be looking for when we're reading these stories. Seasons, very important. And I want you to remember this as you're reading the lottery. So we get a character whose name is Mr. Summers, right? And seasons, just like time, can mean the maturation of something. So in spring, right, that can mean new love or young love. Could be a birth, right? Summer is a more mature part of that time of year. So something that's referred to like, oh, it's a summer love, right? It's a more mature kind of a love, right? So in context with thinking about the lottery and Mr. Summers, I would ask you to think about, well, what does his name then represent, right? Why would that sort of be maturity related? Fall, think of sentience, right? So we're heading towards the trajectory of being older, certainly wiser, but it's also a part where we have decay kind of happening in terms of the season itself. Winter can mean death. It can also mean old age, or something that is dying, as we think about sort of that traditional winter sense of, leaves falling off of trees and hibernation, all of that kind of stuff. Weather also has meaning too. The sun generally can mean happy. It doesn't always mean happy. I've certainly read plenty of stories where stuff takes place during the daytime and it's not happy stuff. But again, this is just sort of universal symbols here. Rain oftentimes means sorrow. Again, that just depends on the context of the story. If you think about the things they carried when Lieutenant Jimmy Cross burns those letters, it's raining. It's a very sorrowful moment. It's a very powerful moment. He is heartbroken. He knows that Martha's never going to love him. He's not even sure he'll be back to the U.S. in order to love her. He's lost one of his men. He's let his men down. He's not sure how many more will die. And he's only 22 years old. So that rain pouring down on him while he's trying to burn these letters is very symbolic at that moment. Wind, if it's light in a story, can mean beauty. If it's heavy, it can mean an erasing. Snow, purity, peace, beauty, cover up. Later next week, I think we're going to read Hunters in the Snow, and a lot of that snow and ice and just sheets of white are going to be a cover up, and it's going to be fairly obvious that it is not purity and peace, but rather the opposite, right? So secrets, death, right? That kind of a thing. Rainbows can also mean hope too, so any sort of weather related elements, there's meaning behind them. All right, flowers, daisies, youth, roses. Certainly the color of the roses matters here, and you could pull back in what I said on the other screen about colors here and apply them particularly to roses. But certainly these are the most common kinds of roses we see in literature. So red certainly means love, white, innocence, pink can mean grace, black, death, and goodbyes. Forget-me-not flowers can mean true love, right? They can also mean, goodbyes and partings. Lilies they often represent death, and or purity and or of a letting go. So that's symbols in literature. Again, that's just kind of a brief overview that I really want you to try and apply. Certainly as you read the things they carry, but more so in the lottery. That's where your symbolic reading is really going to help you out and help you to understand the story. Also, too, for those of you that weren't entirely sure what the class entailed in terms of, just reading and understanding a story, and part of the answer is yes, but it's understanding a story on a really deep level. And part of that deep level comes from understanding the symbols and the symbolism and the structure and character motivation and all of those good things. This is what distinguishes literature from just everything else, right? Literature is sort of that well-crafted piece of art that meets all of these really high qualities for the depth of knowledge that we're looking for as a reader. All right, I'll see you on the discussion boards this week. There'll probably be one, if not two, live chats, so hopefully that'll meet some of your times. I know a lot of you have crazy schedules out there, so I'm trying to just make them at kind of random times just to see who's available, so that way everybody can at least attend one different chat here and there. All right, if you have questions, make sure you email me. I will see you on the discussion boards. Bye.